So by now, many of you have probably heard about the rumored Ryzen 3 3100 featuring 4 cores, 8 threads for about $110. Now that would be a really interesting CPU launch in general, just because AMD already has the Ryzen 5 1600AF in some regions at least available at $85, and it's 6 cores and 12 threads versus the 4 cores and 8 threads of the more modern Zen 2 based Ryzen 3 3100. So that's going to be an interesting launch if it is in fact a CPU AMD's actually coming out with. But of course, before I talk intelligently, or at least even form opinions about the Ryzen 3 3100 and what it could bring to the table, I have to figure out first and foremost, are 4 cores and 8 threads really good for gaming in 2020, or should we be moving beyond the quad core CPUs of the past, and should we be moving towards the future of 6 cores and 12 threads as sort of the base level gaming CPU? Let's talk about that. So later this week, I will be giving you my specific thoughts about the Ryzen 3 3100, so go ahead and subscribe if you're not already subscribed for those thoughts. That should be coming out like Friday, Saturday, somewhere in there. But today we're actually not focused on Ryzen chips really whatsoever, although there is a Ryzen CPU being tested today. We're actually focused on Intel's older quad-core CPUs. In this case, we're focusing on the i7-4770K, which was undoubtedly in its time a fantastic gaming CPU. Now, as you might have guessed from the intro, the i7-4770K does feature 4 cores and 8 threads. It is a fully unlocked chip, so even though it maxes out, I believe, a stock turbo of 3.9 gigahertz, you can fairly easily push these chips up to about 4.5 gigahertz without really even breaking a sweat, and depending on your silicon lottery sample, you may actually be able to get significantly more out of these chips. Now, the 4770K was known for its pretty poor thermal interface material between the heat spreader and the die itself, so mine is actually replaced with liquid metal. If you have a 4770K and you're battling temperatures, it's probably because that TIM underneath the heat spreader is just really bad TIM, and if you replace it with something like liquid metal, it's likely you would actually get much better temperatures and thereby also may see a better overclock. But after that brief digression, we're actually not talking or even thinking much about temperatures, and we are looking at an overclock today a little bit, but temperatures are on the back burner for sure. Today we're actually testing some of our modern games with the 4770K, and I'm running the 4770K in 2 different configurations. First and foremost, we have it at stock, and this is going to see a boost frequency of right at that 3.9 gigahertz across all cores. We're not going to really see things go much higher than that, and this is going to be a really good simulation if you have some of these older i7s that are locked processors and you can't really overclock them easily at all unless you're willing to fiddle with base clock overclocking, and even then you may have very limited success depending on your generation and what your specific chip is. And then of course we are testing the 4770K at 4.5 gigahertz, and that's to give us a little bit better of an idea of just what giving us more clock speed actually gives us in gaming loads with these chips for modern titles. Now, the 4.5 gigahertz overclock might actually even inform us a little bit about what to expect from the Ryzen 3 3100, and that's looking forward to my video later this week on that particular rumored chip in general. But basically, the Ryzen chips on the Zen 2 architecture have a little bit better IPC than the Haswell chips did have, so we should see fairly similar performance from a pretty decent overclock on the 4770K at 4.5 gigahertz and something like the Ryzen 3 3100, but of course I'll give more thoughts on that later on. Now, I'll go ahead and throw up the test bench specs that I'm using for these tests in these games. Now, I'm also including the Ryzen 9 3950X, and I know the RAM configuration is absolutely not comparable between these two. Not only are we on different generations of RAM, we have DDR3 versus DDR4, but we have different capacities in a different configuration altogether. And the whole point of throwing the 3950X onto this chart isn't to give a direct apples to apples comparison. It's to give you an idea of what you can see from a 1080 Ti at these settings when you don't have any speakable bottleneck at the CPU level whatsoever. So basically, the 3950X is there as a reference, almost as a better case scenario. I wouldn't call it best case scenario because the DDR4 memory is only running at 2666 megahertz instead of something much faster like 3200 or even 3600, which we do know that Ryzen loves those faster RAM speeds. So all that being out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the charts and see just what we can expect from 4 cores and 8 threads in 2020. Now we're starting off with Metro Exodus with the built-in benchmark on the normal preset, and with this benchmark we actually see a wide variety of FPS shown. We actually see numbers anywhere from the 110 range on the stock i7-4770K all the way down to in the 50s or even upper 40s at points. So this test actually gives us a wide variety of environments from this game. All that being said, we did see an average FPS of about 95 with the 4770K and a 1% low there of 44. Now with the overclock, we did see a nice little boost on the average as well as that 1% low, and then obviously there the 3950X gave us a little bit better performance yet with a 115 average and a 55 1% low. But all that being said, it is worth pointing out that this game actually did run pretty well. Even in those areas where the FPS was down in the 50s or even upper 40s for the 4770K, what we saw there was no stuttering. It was a consistent upper 40s, lower 50s gameplay there as opposed to a stuttery mess. So even though the FPS there is lower than I would like, it was a very playable experience, or at least it would be a playable experience if it was actually gameplay and not just the built-in benchmark, but this game gets a pass for the 4770K for sure. Now very quickly we're going to go over Red Dead Redemption 2 because we actually saw very little variance between the CPUs in general. The i7s, whether we're talking about the stock clocks or the overclock, saw basically the exact same numbers, and even the Ryzen 9 3950X, which actually got beat in this test barely by the i7s, very consistent across the board. The frame rates were extremely consistent throughout the test. We didn't see any stuttering, but also we saw very little peaking as well. So this would be what I would describe as a 60 FPS, very playable game on the i7-4770K. I have absolutely no complaints other than I would love to see this title get higher FPS in general, but it's fine. Like, it plays just fine. Now, where we see a title that the 4770K is less optimal for is Borderlands 3, and I sort of saw this coming based on my last testing of things like the Ryzen 3 1200 and the Ryzen 5 1600, and sort of looking at those comparisons. So starting off with the 3950X this time, we saw a great experience in Borderlands 3. We saw an average FPS of 118, 1% low there at 86, and a 0.1% low at 67. Even when the FPS dipped with this particular configuration, the Ryzen 9 3950X handled it just fine, and the dips aren't really noticeable when you're still getting a frame rate that's well above 60. Now, that being said, moving over to the i7, the 4770K at stock clocks, the dips were noticeable and it was stuttery at times to the point where I would even call this distracting. With the overclock, we definitely saw a better performing experience here. The problem is you can still notice a stutter here and there. So even with a fairly aggressive overclock on a 4770K, you still see a bit of stuttering here and there with this title. Now, this isn't going to be in every modern title, and hopefully over the course of the next several months, Borderlands 3 maybe gets a little bit better about handling that sort of thing. But the point is, there are some titles out there that are modern AAA titles that just don't love having only 4 cores and 8 threads to play with, and it looks like Borderlands 3 is kind of one of those titles. So let's go ahead and hop into the conclusion then. For most titles in 2020, 4 cores, 8 threads, that's probably going to be okay, and you're going to get a solid gaming experience from that, though we are definitely starting to see more and more titles that take advantage of more and more cores. Borderlands 3 would certainly be one of those. So looking forward, if you're one of those people that likes to kind of future-proof your new PC builds, I don't know that the Ryzen 3100 is the way to go, and I definitely don't know that an older i7 that only has 4 cores and 8 threads is the way to go. And this actually could be a little bit concerning to those of you that are still rocking your 6700Ks or your 7700Ks. You might start to see some titles that really don't like having only 4 cores and 8 threads. Now, depending on the price, of course, this still may be the way to go, because even looking at the 3100 moving forward, you're paying a pretty significant premium to get 2 more cores and 4 more threads by moving up to the 3600 if the 3100 is only $110. But as far as the i7-4770K goes and other i7s like it, if you get a good price, it's still a good gaming chip. Just be aware of some of its limitations. Do your homework. Basically, when you're building a PC, it's always very important to do your homework. Look at the titles that you're going to be playing most, or that you think you're going to be playing most, and look up benchmarks for those. If you're getting an i7-4770K, look up benchmarks of a 4770K running whatever title it is that you are wanting to play. If you were wanting to play Borderlands 3, you may have noticed, hey, it seems like Borderlands 3 doesn't have great 1% and 0.1% lows for that CPU, and you can adjust your purchasing behavior accordingly. But that's kind of what we're seeing in 2020 from 4 cores and 8 threads. I do want to know your guys' thoughts in those comments down below, especially those of you that have these older i7s, or really even some of the first generation Ryzen CPUs that have 4 cores and 8 threads, like the Ryzen 1400 or 1500X. Let me know how your CPU is doing in gaming in those comments down below. And of course, if you like the video, give it a like, share, subscribe, comment. All those things are very helpful for the channel. You can follow me both on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware. And as always, I'll let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane with Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.